Hi, how are you doing?
I'm doing good. How are you doing?
I'm doing well also. So thank you for joining today, and please let me know if there's any audio issues on my side. I do have some backup headphones, etc. And great, so I'll start with just some overall setup. So just to make sure we're on the same page, today I have a behavioral mock interview with you, and I got that you have roughly 7 years of experience and are targeting an L6 plus role. Is that right?
That's correct.
Excellent. And great. Okay, so regarding the target role, so that we can level set a little bit, is there any level specific to a company that it might be relative to, like maybe an Amazon L7 or like a Facebook E6 or E7 or a Microsoft L67, something like this?
So I'm interviewing for a role at TikTok, a tech lead manager role. My assumption is that
Okay,
it's like similar to like an M1 in uh, Meta.
got it. And in terms of title, would that be like a senior manager or
Oh no, it's just called tech lead
the
manager.
director? Uh-huh. Okay, great. Excellent. So that is helpful. Tech lead manager, M1. All right, so I think that's great. So for today, kind of like a normal interview, if we can start off with 1 or 2 minute introductions, then given that this is a mock, but also the interviewing.io site, I'll also give some brief tips and kind of expectations, and then we'll go into the main interview at latest by the 10-minute mark, maybe 7-minute mark, so that we have a solid 40 to 45 minutes as usual for the main part. And then with the remaining time, we can start getting into any feedback and questions. Does that sound like a plan?
Yeah, that sounds like a perfect plan.
Fantastic. So for the intros, would you like to get started or shall I get started? And again, this is anonymous, so feel free to share as much as you're comfortable with.
Sure. Yeah, I can get started. So I'm currently an M1 at
Sure.
Meta, and I've been at Meta for almost 13 years now. 9 years of which I've been like a software engineer, and for the past 3 years I've been like an engineering manager. It's only in like the past 4 to 5 months I've been in like the privacy space. And before that, I've been in like the sales and ad space for like almost 12 years now.
Great. Okay, that is excellent experience. Thank you. All right, so from my side, let's see. So I'm at one of the larger tech companies in the Pacific Northwest, headquartered there. Years of experience, about 9 or 10. I've mostly been a so-called IC or individual contributor, but in the last 4 years or so have been leading more and more people over time. And what else? Yeah, I've been on this site for some time now, IO, and great. That's brief about me. And also, if you're familiar with this IO site, sometimes we do use the text editor, but for most behavioral culture interviews, it's mostly dialogue. So just pointing out, if you want to type anything, you're free to, but there's no expectation to. All right. So great. In terms of some of the overall not clarifications, but thrust of what we generally look for in these interviews are some initial things I'll just note down, which you may already know, of course. And on the respectful side, yeah, we're always looking for, as a person, mutually respectful, great to work with, collaborative with others, proactive. That's one thing. Of course, like when we get into some of your own experiences, like how you anticipated some things and maybe delivered something on your own or early, and also results oriented, right? So if you've managed X number of people on a project, that's great, but kind of rounding out the story maybe with what the business impact was and how the relationship was also built. Do those sort of things kind of make sense?
Yes, it does.
Excellent. And also the STAR method. Are you familiar with that acronym?
Oh yes, like in the previous two interviews that I did, this was brought up, which was like the situation, task, action, and result. I think to a large extent it goes into like the respectful, collaborative, proactive, results oriented. But the idea is that you stick to this so that like you outline very clearly what the
Mhm.
situation was, what was the task that was given to you to resolve the situation, what action did you take, and how did you drive like the result.
Fantastic. Yes, and that's great. Yes, and on the result, yes, how you drove the result and what the result was. That's perfect. Excellent. Thank you. Okay, and for L6 plus, something that I will also note. Oh, and sorry, this last bullet point is it does help to have some stories, if you will, or previous
Mhm.
scenarios at your fingertips. And every now and then there might be a question that is uncommon but relevant, and it's always fine to say, hey, can I take a minute to think about it? That's perfect, sharing your thought process. But on those questions that you feel maybe you've gotten before and you have a good story for it, that's perfect, but we don't want to sound like robotically rehearsed, right? We want to get the sense of, yeah, that person has it top of their mind, but they're really telling me the story, not reading from a script. Okay. Now for L6 Plus, there's, I would say, four additional areas that are sometimes good to touch in. Of course, it's not expected that we touch all of them in the span of 40 minutes or so, but if we can get to at least two of them that you have an opportunity to focus on, this would be great. So for example, one is delegation, right? As we manage more and more people, an example might be that we form relationships with others maybe under us or at our same level that can also be managers of others. So that's one thing. Another is scalability of work. So that can mean how you help others be scalable or did some of your own work on scalability. And comfortable with conflicts, right? Understanding the other side and how you maybe still built a good relationship, even though people might have had different priorities, is an example.
Mhm.
And then the last one, which actually starts getting into so-called like executive level, is managing up, like how you've effectively influenced leadership. Might be on a whole new project or changing course on something that was baked in for a few years. Great. So we're doing well on time. We're near the 10-minute mark, but any questions overall here?
No questions so far.
Fantastic. All right. So let's get started with one question for today. So can you tell me about a time that you disagreed with your manager?
Yes. So the situation that I can think of is when there was a project that was handed to me, and this was a project that wherein like the context over here is there's a project that was called as like growth plans where we were working with like product marketing managers to figure out like how we can optimize their outbound workflow. And the idea behind this is that product marketing managers talk to like product managers and like engineering managers to figure out like, okay, this is a new product that is coming in. We need to ensure that these products are shipped on time and these are the metrics that we need to handle. And these are like the 4 or 5 main metrics that we need to drive in terms of adoption. So this entire process needed to be automated, and this was a new project that was given to me. Now, during road mapping season, the task that was primarily given to me from my manager's perspective was like, okay, you need to figure out what the priority of this particular project is in terms of business impact. and then influence roadmap to get this project onboarded or like offloaded based on like what the relative prioritization is. Now, for one of the first things steps that I took was like consulted with a data scientist to understand like, okay, for a particular project that optimizes processes, how do we need to measure the success of these set of projects? What kind of like prerequisites that are required, and how do we measure like previous and pre-implementation and post-implementation, so that like there could be a good story that could be attached and that can be
Mhm.
presented to leadership in like a road mapping session. Now, once this task was given to me, I engaged with like the data scientist, I engaged with like the product marketing team, and I also to a large extent like engaged with like the engineering managers, because most often than not, their entire workflow was done to like tasks, whereas like most of like the product managers work and product marketing managers work were being done to like Google Docs. So you have this disconnect in terms of understanding like how do we like tie in two different like workflows without overtly like burdening like engineers with like a change in process. So all of these conversations are going on, and to a large extent we had a good enough story that showed that drive three particular things. One, there will be a 10% reduction in overall time to market for any new product that was in like alpha, beta, and a production launch. But the con was there was that you had to do a change management in the product marketing and like product manager departments. Now, this
Mhm.
is where, to a large extent, my manager was pushing back on me, pretty much saying that, okay, the 10% reduction looks fine, but the change management aspect of things where you need to influence an entire org to like onboard onto this tool seems unreasonably complicated. So therefore,
Hmm.
like we need to deprioritize this project in favor of like another project. Now, to a large extent, this agreement was stemming from the fact of like, one, there was a huge amount of time investment that was involved, that would have been involved in convincing leadership on like the product marketing and product marketing managers teams to ensure that they were on board in terms of like why this tool needs to be built out, how the change management should occur, what does that entail in terms of like training for these set of people. So that was one particular major, like I would say, areas of disagreement between me and my manager was like, okay, I felt like this was a project where we have the impact that is not being questioned, but rather the change management of things being questioned. Like, how do we handle this? It's like a too big of a process to be handled by an engineering team, which I understood. Like if you're talking about change management, it's a bigger process. And by the time you realize the impact you're going to have, like, let's assume that if it takes 3 months to do change management, even if you build a tool at like n time, it will might take like n plus 3 time for you to even start realizing the impact of stuff. So especially if you look at like a short timeline of like 6 months or like a yearly review, how do we go about like doing all of these reviews? So all of these questions were brought up from my manager's perspective was like, you're now managing a team. You need to think about all
Mhm.
of these things. So therefore, this project doesn't seem to give you the right ROI. Whereas if you take another set of project, it might give you the right set of ROI. Now, the feedback from my team was that they felt like this particular growth trans project, which even though it had the challenges of change management, they were very interested in like pursuing this. And since so the stance that I took with my manager was that, okay, it looks like I understand the perspective that my manager was coming from, but I also bubbled up the feedback that I was getting from my team and from my stakeholders was like, this project is worthwhile because of the fact of like the impact that is going to be realized. The new project that is
Mhm.
going to be provided to us was to a large extent like it was almost equivalent in terms of impact, but it did not have the same sort of experience that my team would gain in terms of like talking to stakeholders, trying to figure out like, okay, if you have to build a tool where you needed to do change management perspective, how can you do that less or more effortlessly? What kind of like intermediately tools or processes could you entail or build to ensure that people who are just using Google Docs could use like the new tool as seamlessly as possible? Or how can we like ensure that their existing workflows will tie into seamlessly into the tool? So all of these were interesting challenges, like especially on the senior engineers on my team were interested in. So to a large
Mhm.
extent, short, the main things that I did was like speak with my manager, told them the areas where I disagreed with him, and also backed it up with statements from my team and the stakeholders in terms of like how they could like potentially reduce the change management friction that was brought in from my manager's perspective. My manager understood like the pitch that I was trying to bring in from, but he was also like on the fence in terms of like, okay, is this a worthwhile project to go with? So what I did was like, with his permission, like I spoke to like the skip from my org, I spoke to like the skip on like the PMM and PMR, and I also delegated some of the responsibilities to like the POCs from these teams, ensuring that saying that, okay, you need to drive some sort of alignment with your leadership. If they need an engineer in the conversation in terms of ensuring that, okay, how long is the build time? Is it worthwhile? Can we support these set of features? If they need a technical perspective, I can definitely come in. But I cannot at all the time like have conversations with their leadership in areas that I'm not an expert in. So I formed like an unofficial POC group and allocated like certain set of responsibilities. Oh, we all agreed on like responsibilities that we would do in terms of convincing our skip managers and our
Hmm.
managers. We had this like 2 to 3 week period where we set up conversations with our managers, with our skip line managers, and provided like the responses in like in terms of like how long would like the change management take place, how do we ensure that measurement was being taken care of in the appropriate manner, and to a large extent is the leadership aligned from like the PMM and PM standpoint as well. So once we have all of these conversations put in place, to a large extent, like leadership was like, okay, aligned to an aspect of like, okay, it looks like bottoms up feedback that we're getting is that this tool is going to be super useful. This is the measurement that has been set up in terms of like 10% reduction in like operational costs in terms of getting a product from like alpha to production launch. That's significant enough. Now, the revenue aspect of things, we will probably need a long-term measurement, but we do have the data scientists on the team that have committed time as well. So to a large extent, we address these problems one by one from like a manager and from a
Hmm.
leadership perspective, and that helps prioritize like the project. So this was one of those times where my manager agreed with terms of like, okay, these questions or concerns that have been raised have been addressed. So therefore, like this project is good to go forward with. And to a large extent, my team also rallied behind the project in terms of ensuring that, okay, we are enthusiastic about like doing all of this like non-engineering work because from a senior manager, like a senior engineering manager, senior engineer's perspective, they were also interested in like gaining other projects, especially in terms of like excellent collaboration. So, and the final result was
That's,
that, yes, I
mhm.
mean, the initial 10% reduction was realized within like a 3 month period after the project was built, but the revenue impact was realized, I would say 6 months later on. And it was almost like, I would say, it increased revenue by 10% or $10 million dollars specifically for these like early product launches that we wanted to do in terms of like how quickly do we identify advertisers, how quickly do we like measure revenue impact, how quickly are like these product bugs and iterations can be resolved. So to a large extent, it was more, I would say, the revenue impact was more tangential rather than it being like directly tied to the work. But like to a large extent, like internal leadership was aligned, like for an internal tool, this was good enough.
Got it. Thank you. I really appreciate that. That's a really good overview of the situation on the change management versus like the initial perspective on ROI. So if if I followed, and please correct me if I'm wrong, it sounded like initially the disagreement between you and your manager was that your manager was pushing to prioritize projects based on ROI, but on the other hand, you saw more, let's say, longer term or better impact in change management and some of the processes around that. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. So it was more, I would say, from a manager's perspective, they were optimizing for like, okay, what kind of impact that could be immediately realized that could that we would not wait for a longer period of time to realize the impact. But my stance was like, okay, this project from an ROI perspective, yes, it could take longer time to realize. But if you stack rank the project amongst like the other projects that are coming in, neither is this project lesser nor higher in priority. So therefore, like this project is like a long, like good exposure for my team. That is a big win. It helps them in the career development. That's a big win. And to a large extent, we have POCs from like the PMM and PM standpoint. So we have delegated work to ensure that we are not the ones that are driving this work as like the main owners, but rather we have peers that are driving work from there and in terms of convincing their leadership as well. So like to a large extent, this project could have not been prioritized as well. That could have been a result as well. If the leadership from like the other teams were like, okay, this is not worth the time. And I prepared for that eventual scenario as well. It was more or less like, let's try to do this. Let's try to see if the other teams are willing to put their cost up front as well. If yes, this project is worthwhile. If not, then obviously like I will agree with my manager and then take on the project that does have like very clear ROI that has been defined as
Excellent. Yeah, that's great that you prepared for, let's say, the alternative or counterfactual ahead of time. Excellent. So maybe one or two follow-up questions here. You mentioned something really interesting that you shared some feedback with your manager where this feedback or data points were coming from
well.
others. And my question there is, how did you solicit or get this feedback?
Oh, so the feedback process was twofold. So one, from a data scientist perspective, the feedback that I was getting in is like, is this tool useful? And how do we measure the impact of this tool? And that was the feedback I was getting. Then I was like, okay, this is the hypothesis that we could go with, and this is how we can measure it. To a large extent, like this is a viable model of getting the information. So yes, that was one area that I was getting in. And the second one was like, we also had designers on the team who were conducting user research sessions with like the folks from like the PMM, PM, and engineering standpoint in terms of like, okay, let's assume that the work that you're doing flows into the centralized tool. What type of information would you provide? Would it be useful? Would it not be useful? What type of pain points would this address? So we had user research that also backed us up in terms of giving a data point that says that one, how do we measure the impact? Here is the hypothesis, and here is how like we intend on putting measurement in. The second piece was like, here is how the user research sessions that we've conducted is giving us very solid points in terms of saying that, okay, what type of features do we need to build? And how would these features help in like measurement tracking? And three, what type of realized impact would we see from a non-tangible aspect? It's more or less like, do the folks that are going to be using this tool feel like they're comfortable doing the change management to use this tool? And that was what user feedback was giving us is like, yes, like let's assume that I have to go through like a month of like trainings to use this tool. I still feel like this is a worthwhile investment of my time if the realized impact in terms of like reduction is actually viable.
Excellent. And just to kind of round that out a little bit too, is it fair to say that the, let's say, data science perspective from this feedback was maybe more internal facing, so like within your company, and the user research that you conducted was external?
Oh, so both of them were internal. So the user research, this was an
Ah,
internal tool that we were building. So both of these were internal focused, but the types of feedback that we were getting from the two aspects was like, one was more, uh, I would say, uh, in tangential to a large extent. It were pretty much, I'm blanking on the word, but rather like the sentiment from the users in terms of like, okay, let's assume that this tool is going to be used from like 1,000 users. Let's do a survey with these
mhm.
1,000 users to figure out like, okay, will this tool be useful? Here is how like there were mocks that were presented to them in terms of like how the tool would flow. So we got like early signals from them like, okay, is this tool, first of all, is this tool going to be useful to you? And what feature sets would actually make this your life much easier? So that feedback is what user research is giving us. The data scientist was giving us, once this tool is launched, how do you measure the success of this tool? And that helps either like validate or invalidate the initial hypothesis that you have. So that like one, so if the initial question was like, you don't have any measurement, for the folks that are going to be using this tool, do they feel like this tool is going to be useful? Yes, we have user research to back that up. Now, the second question obviously is going to be like, once this tool is launched, how are you going to measure success of this particular tool? We have this framework that's already ready, and this is how we intend on measuring the success of this particular tool. So yes, I mean that's if you look
Mhm.
at it like that's where the manager was coming from is like there's a lot of like assumptions being made in terms of like the usefulness of this tool, versus like other projects where we know very clearly what the ROI is going to be. So that's where like it was more or less like, do I give my team this, I would say, an ambiguous problem statement and ask them to solve for it, which is going to stretch them in like multiple different dimensions? Or do I give them like a project where they know exactly what they need to do, which is going to help them definitely in like their career perspective, but it's not going to challenge them as much as like the ambiguous problem statement that we were dealing
Got it. Thank you. And last follow-up question I had in mind here, and by the way, this is an excellent review of the feedback, and it sounds like you use this feedback to present it to your manager, which then helped out with some next steps. And my question there is, how did you surface or present this feedback to your manager? So for example, did you send your manager an email with, hey, here's a bunch of data points from data science, here's a bunch of surveys from the research user group, or did you have a call with your manager or take them out to lunch? Like, how did you bring up this feedback to them?
Oh, so this was, so at least with my manager, it was more informal meetings where I was trying to gauge feedback in terms of like, okay, what type of questions am I getting? How do I address these set of questions? So it was more or less like, I would say a coaching plus like feedback is how I was interacting with my manager, because they were also understanding like, okay, this is a new area that he's dealing with, so we need to give him like some sort of guidelines or a framework on how to think about this kind of work, so that like they can grow more in their career. I think with the skip level meetings, that was a more formal presentation where, based on all the questions that I received from my manager, it was a more a presentation that addressed the set of questions in terms of like, okay, this is how we are engaging with like the designer team in terms of like doing mocks and doing like user research sessions, and these are the types of feedbacks that we are getting. Here is the alignment process that we have with like the XFN folks in terms of ensuring that we can address the change management concerns that I've been having. And from like, and the third slide basically talked about like, okay, in terms of long-term career growth, this is how like I would see like the senior managers on the team playing like critical roles. This is not going to not only going to help us with this particular project, but it also like for any future like vision projects that we have in terms of pivots that we might do, you can now ensure that our team is now going to be more equipped to deal with like these more ambiguous type of statements as well. So in short, it's like with my manager, it was more informal conversations where it was both coaching plus like questions that I need to answer to get the project prioritized. With the skip, it was a very formal presentation where I answered like it was a presentation in terms of like how are we engaging with like XFNs, how are we like gonna be like answering questions on the impact side, and how do we see this playing out in terms of like long-term career growth of like everyone on the team.
Got it. All right. Thank you. That was comprehensive, and I really appreciate that. So if you're open to it, let's go on to another question. Okay. So yeah, and I'll write it down here after I state it. So if you can tell me about a time that you needed to share a decision with your team that you disagreed with.
Yes. I think this ties in nicely to like your previous question on like the time that I disagreed with my manager. This was like the second piece where was we had a new project that was coming, and this project was called uh, chat management with like external stakeholders. This was again like an ambiguous problem statement that was given to us, was like with the advent of like large language models like towards like the mid of like previous year, one of the projects that was being spun up within the ad space was like, how do we now leverage these large language models to like at least do a pilot with like external like call center agents, so that like they can leverage these chat center models to ensure that most common questions flow through these like chat models first, and then you would only engage with like the call center agents as like a secondary piece, so that like their time is freed up to do more proactive set of calls. Now with this particular situation that was given to us, the task that was given to me specifically was like, okay, you need to now, you now have an XFN set of folks. You have a business engineering team that works directly with like these call center agents. You have an internal support agent team that helps you identify what the common trends and what are the common issues are. And third, here's an ML engineering team that will probably help you like train these models to answer like the common set of questions that have been asked or being identified by like the support agent team. So with these
Mhm.
three themes, that with the task that was given to me was like engage with these teams, try to figure out like how long would this project actually take care of, and now you also like get your team involved in like these early set of conversations so that like they can also like drive most of these conversations, and I'm also able to delegate these responsibilities. So the main thing was that we did like a 3 month, or actually, yeah, it was like a 3 month on and off engagement where we would think on like a weekly basis with like all the three stakeholders, try to figure out like, okay, which call center do we aim towards, and why do we like have specified this particular call center agent, try to identify the common set of trends that we've identified using with like the internal like chat support team, and the third was like engage with like the ML team to understand like, okay, how long would they need to take do they need to take like train a model? How do we ensure that we rate limit like any sort of requests that are coming in? What type of computational cost that are we looking at so that like the costs don't suddenly balloon up to an extent where we are suddenly taking up too many resources from like a meta perspective. So all of these questions were being answered, and once there was a framework that was set up, I assigned my senior engineers to like take over these conversations while I was engaging with my manager and Skip and reporting to them on the progress in terms of like, okay, these are like the major concerns that we are seeing in terms of computational costs. These are like the pros and cons of like approaches that we are taking in. And to a large extent, like this was a scenario where I was pretty excited and the team was pretty excited in terms of engaging with this space. But
Mhm.
this was a scenario where all the feedback that we were getting mostly indicated that yes, this project would be successful if we implemented it well, but there was more risks of this project going not going the way that we expected. But we as a team were willing to take that particular risk. But this was again like where the manager and my skip were both in terms of saying that okay, this is too high a risk where you're not only talking about like a delayed impact in terms of ensuring that, okay, you're going to do this initial pilot, then you're going to retrain the models, try to figure out like, okay, is this actually causing a reduction or is it causing an increase? Now, if you're setting up call centers, especially in terms of expectations, it's very, I would
Mhm.
say, contractual in terms of like, once you say that this chat model is going to at least give an assumption of like 10% reduction, they're going to pivot their call center agents to do something else. And if there's an
Mhm.
increase in terms of like how much capacity a call center agent would actually need to provide in terms of answering these questions, the costs are going to balloon. So not only are the costs going to balloon in terms of like how long you actually take to retrain the models, but also in terms of risk, in terms of what the company faces, because you suddenly are now to a large extent trying to renegotiate the contract because the ML models are not functioning as expected. So this was one of the reasons why we couldn't productionize the chat center model. Neither could we actually go ahead with this particular product because of the fact of like, A, we were training like new models, and therefore we didn't have like a realized impact for it yet. And to a large extent, you have contractual obligations which couldn't be modified if we needed to do any sort of last minute pivots. So with this kind of like
Mhm.
analysis that were found, the final result was that both my manager and Skip were pretty much, I mean, it was a top-down, like, understandably in terms of like a decision that was passed on that said that, okay, we are not going to proceed with this project because of all of these particular risks. You will now need to communicate with your team. And this was a thing where I was very clear upfront with my team in terms of saying that, okay, this is a project that we're all passionate with, but the risk over here is the fact of like, there's a lot of unknowns, and these unknowns not only impact like how we function but how meta engages with like these call center agents as well, which is the reason
Mhm.
why we need to stop this project. Now obviously folks were disappointed, and there were, I mean, it, the disappointment was more or less handled by me, to be honest, but it wasn't a scenario where I expressed like discontent at the decision, but rather I was like, this is a decision that I completely agree with. And the reason I agree with, even though we put so much time into this, is because of the fact of like, it's contractual and we cannot like pivot in these contractual obligations as quickly as we expect. So therefore, like this project is going to be dropped. for now,
Mhm.
but it doesn't mean that we are not going to productionize it in the future. We are not going to be actively engaged with it, but the ML engineering team and the chat support team are still going to continue working with this project in terms of refining the model to ensure that there is, at least to a large extent, they can do some sort of internal testing to ensure that this model can answer like at least 10% of the questions that are going to be manually routed. Once they give us that confidence, we can re-engage with them in terms of building the system end to end. That I would say was like the final result that was driven was like we would still continue with the model, but it won't be our team that's directly engaged with it, but the other two exceptions, while we pivot ourselves to like the other projects that have clear ROI and defined. And to a large extent,
Mhm.
if there are ambiguous problem statements that could be defined as well, we will try to prioritize it. But that was like pretty much the decision that we all arrived at.
Excellent. Thank you. And that's a really great scenario that you described, especially very modern on the pros and cons of LLMs, especially when there's not only excitement, but also some potential barriers, as you mentioned, with like contractual obligations and the cost of doing all of this. So thanks for sharing that. And one or two follow-up questions also here. So one of them is when you shared the, let's say, decision with your team that your team would no longer at the time be continuing with it, did you share this feedback first, maybe with some or through some one-on-ones with your directs, or was it in like a stand-up or some sort of like weekly team meeting or email? I'm just curious how you communicated that.
Sure. So the first thing that I did, even before communicating with my team, was like phrase it out in my head and run it by my manager, just to ensure that there's not any sort of bias that was creeping in from my end that either showed that I was pro this decision or like against this decision. So I did run it by my
Mhm.
manager and I did get feedback in terms of adjusting some language. But to a large extent, once that messaging was like, I would say it was free of bias, or at least I had like I would say a review that showed that, okay, it was free of bias. Then I shared it in like a
Mhm.
stand-up meeting, like a weekly stand-up meeting that I have with my team where we discuss like what has happened like the previous week, what type of blockers are we experiencing, and what is it that each one is going to be doing for this week. That is where like I shared this particular update was like, okay, this is the final decision that has been reached for this particular project. The reason why we are not proceeding with this particular project is because of like the contractual obligations. Like everyone acknowledged like the disappointment in terms of like this is a hot new space. Everyone wants to get like their experience in as quickly as possible before like processes are defined in terms of like which teams does what. But like the main point that I wanted to highlight in the particular meeting was that like a, there is an acknowledgement of the effort that has been put in. B, everyone does
Mhm.
acknowledge that it's the space that is worthwhile the investment. But the reason we are not proceeding is because this is not an area that we can very quickly pivot if things go wrong. And that's the reason why we pulled back on this project until we have a model that is ready enough to say with confidence that it's going to work for the situation and for the measurement that we intend to work. Once that is done, we can probably like re-engage with this particular project. But on and off, that doesn't mean that the folks on the team don't engage with the team. It is pretty much it's like you still have the option of like syncing with these folks, trying to understand like how the models are being built. You still have that particular set of freedom, but at the same time, it's about balancing the time between like the projects that have been assigned to you versus like going with your interest. And this is where, like, to a large extent, like with the skip and the manager, like we did have some sort of negotiation in terms of like, okay, folks can do still spend some time on understanding how these models are being trained because it's a brand new space, but they still would need to like prioritize the projects that have been assigned. But we had some sort of like time commitments which rounded up to like 15% of a week's person time or a time in a week where they can engage with these folks to try to get their hands dirty with like model training as well.
Got it. Yeah, thank you. That makes a lot of sense to acknowledge the efforts from the team, but also add the context on the reason for the decision and how some of it your team could still keep in touch with and not, completely leave it. That's great. Thank you. And maybe as a last follow-up to that question, when your skip and your manager essentially decided, right, for all these reasons, here's why this project will not continue, at least for now, did they tell you, okay, now it's your turn to share this news with your team? Or did one of them volunteer, like, hey, if you want me to all share this feedback with your team? Like, how did that go about, the decision that you would share the feedback with your team?
I would say this was more like collaboratively when we had the leads meeting. The option was given to me in terms of like, hey, do you want to share it or do you want like us to share it in like a team-wide session or org-wide session as to why we went
Hmm.
in the position? I felt like I like it would be better coming from me, and that's where like I volunteered that okay, I will share this update with the team before they hear it in terms of like, oh, suddenly a decision is landed on them. So I wanted to soften the blow as much as possible, which is the reason why I volunteered. That I would say like I volunteered to share the meeting, share the decision with my team in the meeting.
Got it. Excellent. Thank you. Okay, so we have about 10 plus minutes or so, I think, for one more question. And again, I'll state it before I type it. And the question here is, has there been a time where some of your reports have directly asked you, what do I need to do to get promoted?
Yes. So I would say this was a situation back in 2020 when I recently got when I became a manager in 2020. And one of the few questions that I had from like the high performing engineers that I had on my team was like, hey, given like it's the pandemic season and there's like a lot of unknowns in terms of like how performance is going to be like measured, like their main questions was like, I'm right now in like the yellow zone. Like there are zones that like the context for here is that there are zones defined for like different levels. For a level 3 engineer, they're expected to grow to a level 4 within 2 years. For a level 4 engineer, they're expected to grow to like at level 5 within like 2 years. So you have these like timelines that were defined, and the concern that was raised from like two of my reports was that, okay, I'm currently in like the yellow zone. And considering like this is the pandemic and there's like a lot of projects that are in flux, and to a large extent, people have been trying to figure out like what their right work schedule would be. The main questions that were given to me was like, given if A, it's a pandemic, B, there are like a lot of personal things that are going on in people's lives. Like, how is it that I can ensure that I can either get an exemption for the yellow zone or how do I get promoted? And this was like the
Hmm.
question that was given to me as first as like a manager. So to a large extent, I relied on like heavily on getting advice from my manager. Like I didn't, it was more or less like the main concerns were like, how does, if I had to boil it down, the main concern here was like, how is performance going to be measured? I think that's where the questions were coming from. Even though it was being pointed to me as like, how do I get promoted? How do I get an exemption? At the bottom line, it was like, okay, how is performance going to be measured in this distressing time? And how is it
Hmm.
like I need to prepare myself for any eventualities? That was like the two questions that were being asked. And to a large extent, that was being asked across the company as well. And what I pretty much highlighted to my manager and my skip as well was like, hey, this is the trend of questions that are coming in from my team. Main questions are around like, A, performance measurement, how is that going to occur? Two, this is a distressing time for most folks on the team. So either you can expect a drop in productivity or like projects need to be reassigned or reshuffled. Considering most of these things were being planned for in-person time, now that we are all remote, some of the projects that we are working on doesn't make sense anymore. How are you going to pivot about this? So surfacing this feedback helped both the manager and skip understand like, okay, this is a trend of questions that we are not only receiving from your team, but we are also receiving from like every team across like the org. So what we're going to do is like
Hmm.
bubble with feedback up to like the VPs and eventually up to Mark in terms of like trying to get to the Asian in terms of like in this extraordinary situation right now, how do we ensure that we at least have a path going forward for folks. So like not everyone is operating under the assumption that things are normal. Things are definitely not normal. So That's the
Mhm.
decision that, or at least that's the conversation and updates that I was sending to my team on like a weekly basis and during the one-on-ones was that, okay, this these conversations are now happening at like a VP level. I don't have visibility into like what exactly is going on, but at least the early indication seems to be that there might be some sort of exemptions that might be raised, or everyone will get like a meets all. But these are like decisions that are not yet finalized, but this is how the conversation is going. So that like at least to a large extent they at least felt that okay, even though my manager doesn't seem like cannot influence what the final decision is, at least I'm getting communication, and that helped especially during like the remote period that we were with. And after like a 2 or 3 month period, the finally a decision was raised. Like Mark made the post that said that okay, everyone's going to getting a meets all, so there's absolutely no concerns in terms of feedback. They're going to be for folks that are in like a yellow zone, since everyone's getting a meets all. Folks that are in yellow zone can continue being at their existing level for until like the pandemic is over. So that means that at least end of 2021, no one needs to worry about this. But it also doesn't mean that performance can degrade. It pretty much meant that for projects that are being assigned to you, unless you did extraordinary, which is where the manager comes in, as long as you're meeting all
Mhm.
the expectations, you don't have to worry about anything right now. That decision helped like the team to a large extent at least understand like, okay, this is how I can plan my career forward. If I do extraordinary well, I'll still be rewarded. But as long as I meet the expectations, I do not have to worry about like aiming for a promotion. That I would say was like how I dealt with this particular like phase of like how do I get promoted. That was happened during like 2020 to be honest. And I have a
Mhm.
more recent example of this as well, where like the pandemic is
Sure.
over, 2023, there's a new engineer that was assigned to me, and the question was pretty much was like, okay, I'm currently in L3, how do I get promoted? Can I get a promotion within the 6 months period? This was a more direct point. I can go into this
Mm.
particular case if you feel like, yeah, if we have enough time over here, but I wanted to get your thoughts before I tackle that scenario.
Yeah, thank you. So maybe two thoughts here. One is that's really excellent context on the pandemic and how the pandemic influenced some of the subtext of the question, right? How do I get promoted? And you teased out or discovered that a lot of it was on the overall uncertainty, right? Not necessarily on specific individuals' performance, but on the kind of larger state of things. And so, yeah, that really helps in that context for sure, and how you addressed it. But yeah, I think to maybe complement that, it would be good to maybe get a 3 to 5 minute or so summary on the more recent individual that asked you, if you're open to it, kind of summarizing that situation.
Oh, yes, definitely. Yeah. So this was a brand new engineer that
Mhm.
joined the team in March of this year. And I was assigned this particular engineer. And that was pretty much the open question over there was like, they were ambitious as expected from like a young person. And the question that was posed to me was like, okay, I'm a brand new engineer. I'm excited to go. I'm aiming for a promotion like within a 6 months period. So what is it that I can do to get promoted within like a 6 months period? And and to a large extent, the way that I handled this particular conversation was like, A, giving a very realistic scenario of like how PSC actually works at Meta, and especially the context around like sustained impact. So what I told him was like, okay, let's assume that you're aiming for a promotion within 6 months period. I would say that's definitely not possible. Like that's an
Mhm.
expectation that I'm setting up front in terms of like saying that whether it's possible or not, that's definitely not possible. Now, is that a reflection on your performance or your caliber as an engineer? It's definitely not. It's mostly how like PLC at Meta is being designed over here is that we are not looking at like short-term impact for like folks to suddenly show a sudden spike in impact and sudden reduction impact over like the previous half. That is not what we are looking at, but rather the philosophy over here is lagging promotion, where we are giving you projects that are at your level currently. If you perform well, then you're given more challenging projects that help you stretch your like expectations to like the next level. And once you show that you are able to do this set of like projects, you'll be given more and more challenging projects. That helps not only like me, but also the other engineering managers within the org understand what capability and what type of projects that you're working at. And this is how your setup will be in terms of like, okay, within the first 3 months, this is how the type of projects that I'll be giving to you that has like tasks that are given at a detailed level and you are expected to like execute on time for these set of tasks. And after that, next 3 months period is where you'll be given like more ambiguous problems that are not too ambiguous at like a level 5 level, but rather what the expectation would be that you'll be given a particular task without the details and expected you to now fill out like how you go about accomplishing this particular task for a single project. That behavior will help us understand like are you able to take on like more and more ambiguous set of problems. Here are the level 3 and level 4 expectations that are transparently provided like in the internal wiki, so that like you can also have a mental model in terms of like how you need to function. And once you do this, you'll be given more projects where you're given exposure to other team members as well. So that like not only me, but you also get peer feedback that helps back up the behaviors that we expect from a level 4. And all of this cannot be realized within a 6 months period because most folks require at least like 8 to 9 month period. That's the average that we expect. And once you have shown this sustained level of impact, it's not only my word that people need to take for, but there's also like the peer feedback that you're really getting. All of this will help you get to a level 4 within like a realistically like a year's worth of time, and it's not going to be a 6 months period of time. So that's how I
Mm-hmm.
handled this particular conversation was like A, very clearly setting expectations up front, and B, describing the process in terms of like how I intend to like manage their a career in a long-term perspective, and also how I expect them to perform on like a 3 to 4 month period. I did also
Mm-hmm.
provide like there are exceptions to this. Let's assume that within the 3 month period, you're not only able to knock all the projects off, but you're also proactively asking for team members in terms of like getting more complex projects. That's a good signal that we are sending that, okay, this person is capable of handling more and more. And once that happens, there is a scenario that within an 8 month period, I'm getting questions from other engineering managers. I'm like, oh, this person at who's at a level 3 is being able to handle at like level 4 projects. Like, I think we should be able to give him a promotion. That is a perfect signal for me to like put you up from promotion. So one is me preparing a case for your promotion. Two, you displaying the qualities eloquently to like other engineering managers where I'm getting questions as to why like we are not putting you up for promotion. That is a more stretch goal for you, but that has definitely happened. But I would say aim for like what is it manageable, and definitely if you feel like you can stretch yourself, you're more than welcome to stretch yourself. Where you give me a plan, and we can work towards that as well. So I did provide the two process
Mm-hmm.
in like what an exceptional performance looks like, and what the normal performance looks like, gave the person the option of in terms of like what path would they like to choose, and like we can adapt to it as and when like we go through it. The end result was that okay, for the it was like within a year's time he was able to show sustained impact, and we did give him a promotion. To be honest, that was like the plan
Mm-hmm.
that we agreed upon, and that's the plan that we are working towards right now. He's on track for a promotion because he joined March. By end of this year, he
Mm-hmm.
should like sustained impact. So I'm putting him for promotion for like February of next year.
Excellent. That's good news. And have you communicated to this person like, hey, I'm getting the promotion package ready for you, or is it more standard, maybe in your philosophy or at your company, to maybe not disclose that information and only tell the individual if it goes completely through?
The idea is that we give them a promotion package and we tell them that, okay, this is now currently being reviewed with the other
Ah,
folks. But what we cannot guarantee is that the promotion is going to through. It's more or less like you're being put up for promotion.
mhm. Excellent. Okay, so we've got about 5 or 6 minutes, and if you're okay with it, I'd like to spend maybe 3 to 4 minutes on my own initial feedback, and then in the last minute or two, some comments. I do have a hard stop, but I think we made really good progress on the questions. So yeah, if you're open to it, I'll start with some of my own comments here.
Yes, that would be super useful. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, so overall, I thought you did really well. You answered all the questions, you stuck with STAR, and you interspersed good, in my opinion, leadership and delegation. So that's initial high level. And just some things I might, I suppose, maybe call them nitpicks, right? Sometimes these nitpicks are interviewer dependent, but one that comes to mind is on, let's say, setting some of the trust building relationship with your direct reports and maybe some of your interactions with your manager or skip. So one example, like the last question that I asked is slightly loaded, but it does come up, right, when people ask, how do I get promoted?
Yeah.
The nitpick here is that if you wanted to, you could lean a little bit on the beginning on saying things like, hey, it's a fair question, but the risk that we sometimes run as managers is having a very transactional relationship with our directs, meaning the direct says or asks, like, give me a list of to-dos, manager provides the to-dos, they do them, and it's done. That's sometimes like the coin machine model, which is sometimes called for, maybe on some projects. But sometimes as managers for longer term, right, if this is going to be a direct that you can hopefully build trust with and count on in tricky situations, getting to know them a little bit more as a person and translating the question a little bit to say, hey, direct, I understand you want to get promoted, but maybe the right question is, what can you do to help me and to help the team? Right? Because then it starts becoming something more like a proactive seed that you're planting in the direct's mind, right? Like,
Got it.
come to me, sure, if you have some questions, but if you're not always expecting me to give you a list of to-dos, then that direct might eventually start thinking a little bit more independently, like, oh, okay, my first priority is to help my manager and the team. Like, what can I do? Right? What can I build, or how can I get answers to questions on my own? Things like this. Does that sort of make sense? I hope I
Yeah.
articulated some of that
Oh,
correctly.
it does.
Cool.
It's more or less like phrasing it rather than saying that, okay, you're not going to get promoted within the 6 months period. It's phrasing it more in terms
Right.
of, okay, like that's a valid question, acknowledge the person's question rather than dismissing it. And then ensure that you have a path forward in terms of like giving them a mental model in terms of like, this is how we think about this. If you start thinking about this
Mm-hmm.
more naturally, this is going to help you get promoted without you actually thinking about it. It's going to be a natural part of your progression and in the company.
Exactly, exactly. Because then you start resolving the tricky thing of transaction-based to like growth mindset. Uh, yeah, and the other nitpick I would have is you brought up really good situations where your manager or skip was involved, and something that might help is emphasizing here and there a little bit how you specifically interacted with them to say like, oh, this manager and I, we have really good and informal conversations over lunch. So I waited for the next time that we had lunch to broach this or that topic. Or my manager and I tend to communicate really well, I don't know, over a video call. And that's our preferred format. So I waited for the next time for that opportunity to come up, something that tells the interviewer a little bit about your day-to-day and how you interact with people. Certainly it's okay to start a little bit abstractly and said, hey, they communicated with me and I communicated with them. That's perfectly fine. But if you can add some of those kind of human touch details, this
So,
might also help in some of the behavioral.
yeah, this is super useful. Thank you.
And yeah, yeah, of course. And yeah, I apologize. We're near time, so I do have 1 or 2 more minutes if you have, let's say, one comment or one question for me.
Uh, I mean, nothing to be honest. Like all of these questions were things that I don't think I've gotten before, but I
Hmm.
think the clarification that you asked was very clear. It's like when you're saying that you're going to interact with someone, just clarify, like give
Hmm.
context in terms of saying that, okay, I set up like a weekly one-on-one with my manager to discuss like in general, like how projects are going along. And in these meetings is where like I brought up like the project status and how we need to engage with like XFN folks, and this is where this served as like my primary means of like getting feedback from my manager. And this is where like we also made a decision
Hmm.
of like, okay, this is okay for me to like get my skip involved, get feedback from them, and then like we can proceed forward in terms of like how this project needs to be prioritized.
Yeah, absolutely. And that kind of human touch thing might also be a little bit company or team dependent, but it definitely helps give some more context as to maybe helping your interviewer feel like, boy, I would be really excited to work with this person because they're paying attention, like how to best interact, right? Phone call, lunch, etc.
Oh, yep.
So again, those were nitpicks, but I think you did well. And yeah, it was a privilege to speak with you. Thanks for the interview today.
Oh, thank you. And it was a privilege speaking with you as well. And I really appreciate the question and the feedback that you provided.
Excellent. All right. Well, thanks again. And yeah, have a good rest of the day.